All right. I'm going to get started. I think people will probably flow in. It's a little bit after 1:30. I actually have a lot of slides, so I'm going to kind of push through this information, which is a little bit of a shame because it really deserves a lot of attentiveness. But I feel like there's a lot to say, and I want to make sure I kind of get through it. And if you have sort of like an urgent question, please ask. Otherwise, I'll try and get through with a few minutes at the end for some questions. So my name is Stephen Morgan, and I'm, like I was saying this morning.
We're having a little trouble back here hearing you.
Okay. Well, this is a different mic. Am I supposed to have a mic for this room?
There's one up there.
Up closer. Oh, no, this is for that. This is for this video.
What about on the podium? Does that one work?
Well, I can also talk at this pitch. Does that work? It's just I'm going to start to sound furious after a while, so you have to bear with me. My name's Stephen Morgan, and as I said this morning, I'm the outgoing director of a peer support center for psychiatric survivors, and I'm going to be the project developer on Soteria. And so I just wanted to introduce myself about how I came into this work. I'm a person with lived experience. I'm a psychiatric survivor. I've had my time in the loony bin, took drugs for many years. And I got into this work by as a certified peer specialist, which is basically different states have trainings for people with lived experience to then work in traditional settings from that experience. When I worked in the traditional system, when I started off, I very much bought into this idea that I had a mental illness, I had a chemical imbalance, I was going to be chronically mentally ill, and I needed to take medications which fixed it. As I worked, I worked for a year in Atlanta, and then I moved up to Vermont, and I worked in the traditional mental health system for 2 years in Vermont. It was a good experience, but what happened during that time was I actually started to challenge some of my own thinking. I met people that started to challenge it. I ended up coming off of my medications slowly against medical advice, and I ended up doing all right, and actually was quite well. And I started to do a lot of research into, well, what had happened? I thought for the 3.5 years I took these meds, I took over 20 kinds of meds. I thought that I had a chemical imbalance. Why isn't that blowing up right now? And if I keep talking loud and fast, y'all might think it's blowing up, but I assure you it's just my personality. So the deal was that once I started to do that, I started to see everything very differently, and I just started to see the work I was doing very differently. And I noticed that people that were coming into the traditional mental health system, that they weren't really leaving, that at least into CRT services, which might be by virtue that that's supposed to be for the people that are having the hardest time, but it just seemed like that, especially young people were coming in, they were gaining a lot of weight, they would look sedated, and then they would get on disability, and I was just like, I don't know where the exit path is for that, and it really troubled me. And at the same time, I was coming across literature that was showing that people could do well with different kinds of approaches. So that, at that time, I came across this book, Soteria, and I've been an advocate for the model ever since. I should say I'm no expert on Soteria. There's a lot of people that have been putting a lot of research and time into thinking about Soteria. I'm looking forward to becoming more of an expert. That's part of what I'm going to be doing when I actually start my job in October. But I will share with you guys today what I do know. In order to get to kind of looking at what Soteria is, we're going to have to spend most of this presentation looking at why the current model is sort of off. I really feel like you can't sort of erect a new edifice without kind of deconstructing the old one. So let's start with Vermont Act 79. Like I said this morning, Vermont Act 79 says mental health care throughout the state shall include at least the following: alternative treatment options for individuals seeking to avoid or reduce reliance on medications. Our legislature has given a vote to basically mandate that we have alternative treatment options so that we don't have a one-size-fits-all system anymore. The Commissioner of Mental Health, and this is the language for creating a Soteria House. The Commissioner of Mental Health is authorized to contract for a voluntary 5-bed residence for individuals seeking to avoid or reduce reliance on medication or having an initial episode of psychosis. The residence shall be peer-supported and non-coercive, and treatment shall be focused on a non-traditional, interpersonal, and psychosocial approach with minimal use of psychotropic medications to facilitate recovery in individuals seeking an alternative to traditional hospitalization. It's telling that we actually use the word non-coercive in the legislation. I think it's telling because it sort of assumes that we have to spell that out. because coercion is it's an integral part of a lot of mental health services, sometimes done very subtly. So this is about creating something that's going to be non-coercive. So the Soteria Vermont model in a nutshell is using principles from the success of the original Soteria House. Soteria Vermont will be an unlocked residence in Chittenden County for folks having a first psychotic break that facilitates recovery by being with individuals through their experiences. And that's it. So thank you guys for coming. And I wish that was it. The original Soteria was a residence in California designed by Dr. Loren Mosher, who was the head of schizophrenia studies, and it was funded by the National Institute of Mental Health. It operated from 1971 to 1982 for 11 years. It admitted individuals almost exclusively having a first or second episode of psychosis and who were mostly neuroleptic naive. Some of this changed over time as they had to take private referrals, but mostly that was true. It was minimal medication in a home-like environment staffed by non-professionals and having a high level of tolerance for and adaptability to distressing experiences. The criteria for admission, Soteria was rigorously studied against controls at a traditional hospital. People would show up at the screening facilities, and the screening facilities would say, do you want to go to they would randomly assign people to Soteria or to the hospital tradition as usual. So the people that came through that study, which was most of the Soteria clients, this was the criteria for admission. No more than one previous hospitalization for 4 weeks or less with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, judged in need of hospitalization by emergency screening facilities, evaluated as having schizophrenia they actually had 3 independent clinicians evaluated, just so that there was no question that they were working with people that actually would have a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Only young single people. It was 15 to 32. Eventually they had to do 18 to 32. They chose that group because they were statistically likely to have the worst outcomes. Married people apparently have better outcomes, and they wanted to try a different approach with people that have the worst outcomes. Yeah, there are people laughing. I guess there is some humor in that. But the context for creating a Soteria then at the end in the early 70s was basically the age of lobotomy was coming to an end. Life magazine had exposed some of the horrors that were going on inside asylums, and that sort of reached the public eye. There was public support for shutting down asylums and creating community services. You had King Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in 1963, a very important and influential novel, very good novel too. There were serious challenges to psychiatry as a legitimate medical profession coming from within psychiatry. You had people like Thomas Szasz, David Cooper, Artie Lang, and then you had people sort of like Michel Foucault. If anyone can actually understand what he's saying, please let me know. But he was sort of challenging it from a cultural, sociological perspective. And then you had the culture of the 60s. It's favorable to experimentation, existentialism, and meaning making. It's telling that the National Institute of Mental Health was actually very interested in funding an alternative back then. So before even getting anywhere, let's look at how did Soteria do, because they measured their services against traditional hospitals. This is a meta-analysis that was done in 2008 of basically all of the Soteria studies. It's not really meta because there's very few studies, but they looked at all of them. The studies included in this review suggest that the Soteria paradigm yields equal and in certain specific areas better results in the treatment of people diagnosed with first or second episode schizophrenia spectrum disorders, achieving this with considerably lower use of medication when compared with conventional medication-based approaches. It's a little bit confusing when you start to get into Soteria data because they did 2 different cohorts, one from 71 to 76 and one from 76 to 81. And one of them was considered inadmissible because Loren Mosher was part of the, as far as I understand it, was because Loren Mosher was part of the treatment. They didn't do the, they said they didn't do the random assigning correctly. So anyways, I took the one that was admissible. It's actually, the data on this isn't as good as the first one. When they look at the actual, when they take all of Soteria's life and put it together, Soteria did better than this. But I feel it's better to be conservative and just put up the stuff that's the least, I guess it's the most prone to skepticism. What you see here is that 6 weeks, people that went to Soteria, people went to the hospitals, basically had the same levels of symptom reduction. That's what this means, global psychopathology. It's funny, have you ever heard a human say, I'm so glad my global psychopathology has gone down? Anyways, but that's what we measure things in. They had a very similar change from admission, and the global improvement was very similar. But only 12% of the people took continuous neuroleptics while at Soteria, whereas 98% of them at the hospital took it. So they did this with, and in this 6-week period of time too, about a third took some medications at Soteria, and we'll get into this in a little bit, but it was a very different way of using medications, whereas 100% took them at some point at the hospital. Yes?
How's this sound? Are you having any problems? Or?
Am I loud enough and everything? Great. Yeah, I think we're fine.
Okay.
Thanks, Nick. The 2-year results, people, did a little bit better through Soteria after 2 years. And over time, if people were at Soteria longer, and actually this data reflects too that people would leave Soteria. Say they'd be there for 3 months, they would leave, and when they would be followed up 2 years later, they might have been rehospitalized, they might have seen a private psychiatrist. So, you see higher drug use numbers, like about half the people at that point had used neuroleptics. And then with the hospital, you still have a much higher percentage. This doesn't say that only 70% of the people that went to the hospital took medication. It means that people left the hospital and went off medication. So not all of them were on it when they did the 2-year follow-up. But again, you have Soteria doing as well. And the measures they did better were there was 8 measures of the global psychopathology, and some of them they did individually better. So by the way, Soteria, to start off with, is no panacea. This is not a program that's going to solve all of the problems for first episode psychosis. They did not, they had, there's plenty of people that didn't get well at Soteria, but there was also plenty of people that did. And I think overall, what they say in the book at least is about 3/4 of the people got better. So what's our context for creating a Soteria now? Well, rates of diagnosis of early onset schizophrenia are significantly increasing. Hospitalization is the only public option for individuals experiencing first break psychosis who are extremely distressed and need a break from circumstances. The hospital's approach to psychosis is almost invariably to prescribe, coerce, or force psychiatric medications upon individuals. Clinicians at hospitals often see first break psychosis as the first step towards chronic mental illness. So people are diagnosed with long-term chronic conditions, told to stay on medications indefinitely, and often internalize the hopelessness of that message. By using coercion, sometimes force, the current system creates distrust in people and makes them more reluctant to seek help voluntarily in the future. That's a huge issue. If you go to the hospital and you're having psychosis and nobody's validating it and they want to put you on these meds that you don't want to take, and if they eventually force them on you, obviously you're not going to, and I would imagine in most cases, feel like that's a service that you want to go to. Again, it's traumatizing. So how is that approach working out? Well, let's look to the director of the National Institute of Mental Health. This is our federal agency, Thomas Insel. No radical himself. Treatments, especially pharmacological treatments, have been in wide use for nearly half a century, yet there is little evidence that these treatments have substantially improved outcomes for most people with schizophrenia. Little evidence that it's improved anything. Sustained recovery occurs in less than 14% within the first 5 years for people having a psychotic episode. Longer-term outcomes may be marginally better. Throughout Europe, less than 20% with schizophrenia are employed. A large U.S. study found nearly 20% homeless in a 1-year follow-up. And a recent report from a patient advocacy group, the bad guys over at Treatment Advocacy Center, reported that in the U.S., those with serious mental illness were 3 times more likely to be found in the criminal justice system than in hospitals. So our current paradigm of care is not doing so well. There's dangers in our current approach. Research shows that antipsychotic drugs have severe side effect profiles, can contribute to early death, cause extraordinary rates of diabetes and metabolic disorders, and often rob vitality. Many antipsychotic drugs significantly shrink brain volume and cause other physiological brain changes in proportion to the dose and frequency taken. Long-term antipsychotic drug use often makes individuals more vulnerable to relapse and to withdrawal psychosis. What's withdrawal psychosis? Does anyone want to say what that is? Does anyone know? Yeah, I'm sure people know it. Yes. What's withdrawal psychosis?
Well, sort of that when someone becomes the fact of stopping taking a medication causes more psychotic experiences for someone, basically, right?
Absolutely. Once you take the medications for long enough, your brain has adapted to them. You pull them away, your brain is in a functionally different state. And it generally looks like psychosis. And then you can't teeter out what's actually there, what's caused from withdrawal. And usually that's affirmation to clinicians that they really are mentally ill. But it could just be from withdrawing, and withdrawing abruptly. Since the advent of antipsychotic drugs, rates of long-term disability due to mental illness have been increasing, not decreasing. Robert Whitaker wrote the book on it. The majority of people quit taking antipsychotics after a short amount of time anyway, mostly due to intolerable side effects, which then places them at high risk of withdrawal syndrome. The largest study ever done of antipsychotics, of atypical antipsychotics, was called the Katie trials, and they did them all across the country in natural community settings to see how are people doing when they take antipsychotics. What they found was that in 18 months, 75%, 3/4 of the people had quit taking them, mostly due to side effects. They then took those people, put them on a different antipsychotic, and followed back up at another 18 months to see how they're doing. Of that proportion, another 75% had quit taking them. By the end, there were so few people still taking them in the study that the conclusions were pretty grim. So let's look at some of this data in more detail. I don't want to just throw this up and have it be an ideology. I want to actually show you the data. And this is going to take a little bit, but it's worth getting through it, I believe. The World Health Organization studies. In the late 70s, there was a lot of psychiatrists and researchers did studies in 10 different countries across the world to see how are people doing in rich countries and how are people doing in poor countries who are diagnosed with schizophrenia. What they found was that in poor countries, that only 16% were taking medication for most of the 2 years that they did. It was a 2-year follow-up for most of the 2 years. Yet 63% of them were having a full course of recovery. They found in the rich countries, about 2/3, 60% of people were taking the medications for most of the 2 years, but only 1/3 were in recovery. The World Health Organization states a remarkable and consistent finding has been that in developing countries, schizophrenics have a better outcome. That's their word. This was based on the fact that more outcomes in the developing world, or more patients in the developing world remain symptom-free for longer periods after the initial episode. This length of remission, which was a symptom-free period, was unrelated to drug treatment, since many in the developing world did not receive continuous treatment. Psychosocial factors such as better family support, community tolerance, extended networks, and more favorable job opportunities have been postulated as the reasons for this observation. This was a very controversial study because people were like, no, this couldn't have been true, so they repeated it and got the same results. Martin Harrow has been doing a study, a longitudinal study in 5, 10, 15, 20-year checkups to see how people are doing who had psychosis and affective disorders and schizophrenia, diagnosis of schizophrenia. And this is at the 15-year follow-up. He found that the people that had self-selected to go off of medication, only 28% of them at the 15-year follow-up still had any psychotic activity. But the people that stayed on medication for that for most of the 15 years, 64% of them, 2/3 of them, had psychotic activity, which is not what you would expect to see if the antipsychotics were taking away psychosis in a sense that would really justify widespread use. The 20-year study just came out, and this is just kind of another way of looking at this stuff. These are the people that stayed on the medication, and this is their level of recovery. These are the people that went off the medication. 4, 7, 10 years, 15 years. The people that went off the medication had higher rates of recovery. The people that stayed on, the recovery rate's about 5%. People are critical of this study. It's a naturalized study because they say that the people that stayed on are sicker. That's why they're not having more recovery. But when you take this alongside a lot of other studies, it starts to present a compelling picture. And then in 2011, some very upsetting news came out from Nancy Andreasen and colleagues. Andreasen wrote biological psychiatry. She is came from that viewpoint, but they did a longitudinal study looking at people's brains and people who took antipsychotic drugs. And this is what they found. During longitudinal follow-up of 211 patients, antipsychotic treatment reflected national prescribing practices in 1991 through 2009. Longer follow-up correlated with smaller brain tissue volumes and larger cerebrospinal fluid volumes. Greater intensity of antipsychotic treatment was associated with indicators of generalized and specific brain tissue reduction after controlling for the effects of 3 predictors. More antipsychotic treatment was associated with smaller gray matter volumes. Progressive decrement in white matter volume was the most evident among patients who received more antipsychotic treatment. Illness severity had relatively modest correlations with tissue volume reduction, and alcohol illicit drug misuse had no significant associations when effects of the other variables were adjusted. In other words, people lost portions of their brain, and it wasn't because they were more ill. They found that had modest correlations. What they did find was that the more antipsychotics they took, the more brain loss that they had. And this is just a chart showing that. So the people that had the most treatment had more of a slope than the people with the intermediate and the least treatment. Which, I should say right away, does not mean that no one should ever take antipsychotic drugs in any capacity. People have all kinds of different brain patterns. When you look at these studies, you can see some people lost some brain, got some brain back, had some brain come and then go away. You just look at the aggregate, but I think the overall message is this is a problem. This just came out last month. They looked at first meta-analysis of brain studies of people that were having a first episode of psychosis. And the green represents people that were neuroleptic naive. They weren't. This is actually a very difficult thing because most neuroleptic naive studies, the patients really aren't neuroleptic naive. They've been taking them for about 3-4 weeks, but they're still called neuroleptic naive. So you can see that with the people that took neuroleptic or didn't take neuroleptics, they had some. This is the sort of effect size, so the change in different areas of the brain. They had some differences from what would be like baseline with controls. But taking an antipsychotic, look what happens. The effect size of whether you're increasing or decreasing these portions of your brain just dramatically increases that already small thing. So this would say to me that if you're having psychosis, you may have something, the correlation in your brain may be like some kind of subtle things going on, but you take antipsychotics and it can dramatically inflate that effect size. And again, I want to actually, I don't actually, there's been studies that have shown that people that are truly neuroleptic naive, that haven't taken any medications, don't have any differences in brain patterns than healthy controls. The Haldol Effect on first episode people, this is very disturbing. Joseph Lieberman, Archives of General Psychiatry, gave Haldol to people, Zyprexa to people, and then controls. What they found, and they looked at it at 12 weeks, 24 weeks, a year, and 2 years, the people that took Zyprexa and the controls, their brains kind of went up and down. This is the total brain matter volume. The people that took Haldol consistently at 12 weeks had lost 5% of their brain, at 24 weeks had lost 10%, at 52 weeks had lost about 13%, and at 2 years had lost about 14%. And I say of your brain because that's the gray matter volume, which constitutes most of your brain. I can't look at this and ever see an argument again for anyone taking Haldol more than 3 days, because this is a very evident, steady pattern. It also shows that maybe some other drugs don't have the same kinds of deleterious effects on brain volume. In addition, and I'm sorry to this is all bummer stuff. I hope that when we get into this Soteria, I'll be a little bit more hopeful. We'll say the bummer stuff for about 15 more minutes, and I'll be done, I swear. The impact of diagnosis that happens to people in the traditional settings. This is from Pat Deegan, who was hospitalized 9 times. He's an amazing person, an amazing writer. She says that professionals' reification of the diagnosis of schizophrenia was oppressive because it subjugated my humanity such that everything I did was interpreted as part of psychiatric disability. It was as if professionals and later friends, family, teachers, and others put on a pair of warped glasses and began to view all of my behavior through the lens of disability. Once my diagnosis was known, all of my behavior was open for pathological interpretation. For instance, I have always been a quiet, contemplative type of person. Even as a kid, I had this lovely quality of being drawn to contemplate nature and the world around me. However, once diagnosed with schizophrenia, these same qualities were interpreted through the lens of disability. I was not a quiet and contemplative kid anymore. Instead, rehab staff would write in their notes that I was guarded, suspicious, and aloof. Sometimes what you see is what you get. Impact of diagnosis over time, from Sherry Mead. We find that many of us who have used mental health services have been told what we have, how it will be treated, and how we must think about arranging our lives around this thing. We have then begun to see our lives as a series of problems or symptoms, and we have forgotten that there might be other ways to interpret our experiences. Because of this, we have felt different and alone and other than much of our lives, leaving us in relationships that have been less than mutually empowering, and more often than not, destructive and infantilizing. We have learned to understand our experiences as signs of illness while burying histories of past violence and abuse. We have lost our power and our choices in most relationships. We have learned to either act as if or we have become dependent on professional interpretation of our everyday experiences. The last thing we'll look at is trauma and psychosis. An overwhelming amount of evidence demonstrates that adverse childhood events can lead to mental health problems in adulthood, including psychosis, bipolar affective symptoms, depression, borderline, and so on. The vast majority of people diagnosed with major psychiatric disorders have histories of trauma, neglect, or abuse. It's usually between 50 and 90% of people surveyed in hospital or mental health settings. A recent meta-analysis concluded that childhood trauma increased your risk of developing psychosis by a factor of 2.8. Other studies put this factor much higher. I've seen it as high as 15. You're 15 times more likely to have psychosis if you have trauma. But this one, the meta-analysis said 2.8. A dose-response relationship exists, such that the more trauma one has, the more substantially at risk she is for psychosis. And traumatizing experiences can change your brain. Actually, they do change your brain in significant ways and alter the course of its development. The ACE study, the largest study ever done, epidemiological study ever done on trauma, 17,000 people, showed that this is the number of traumas that people had. The more trauma that they had, this is the percentage who hallucinated. The more trauma, the more likely you are to have hallucinated. This same pattern is evident for depression. It's evident for suicide. It's evident for having physical illness. It's all across the board. They found that there's a significant and graded relationship between a history of multiple childhood traumas and hallucinations. Abuse and trauma suffered in the earlier years of development resulted in far greater likelihood of pre-psychotic and psychotic symptoms. Compared to persons with zero trauma, those with 7 or more had a 5-fold increase in the risk of reporting hallucinations. The number of times the National Institute of Mental Health uses the word trauma in any of its informational materials on schizophrenia. 0. This is a problem because if we're not talking about what's going on in the larger social context and in families, and sometimes families are wonderful to their kids, but there's still sometimes trauma that happens outside of that kind of stuff in school systems and work. There's trauma that can happen from taking way too many antibiotics. There's trauma that can happen across the board. If we're not talking about this stuff and we're saying it's in you, it's your brain is the problem, the disease, we're not going to actually fix those larger contextual problems. So let's get into starting to look at some different ways of looking at psychosis. As I just went through, this is kind of my little map of what I see as conventional versus alternative views of psychosis. And the conventional or the current view of psychosis, the framework is essentially biological. The cause is a brain disease, it's inherited genes, epigenetics, which is the idea that you have the genes that are bad, but the environment triggers them. Neurodevelopmental, that basically your brain goes through all of these different problematic formations throughout time and eventually is in a dysfunctional state. The nature in the conventional approach of psychosis is that it's toxic, that it's nonsensible, don't talk to it, that it's dangerous, and that it's essentially symptomatic, that it produces symptoms. The approach is generally a mental illness diagnosis, psychotropic medication indefinitely, and to be fair, there's plenty of other approaches that people are doing as well, especially with some of the first episode research that's coming out right now. But this is sort of a foundational thing. The goal is symptom elimination and illness acceptance. And if you don't accept your illness, what does that mean? Crazy. You lack insight. You lack insight. The outlook on the conventional framework is that psychosis is essentially chronic and to have maintenance therapies to sort of keep up with it. So what would an alternative framework for psychosis look like? Well, to start off with, the framework would be essentially contextual. That it doesn't, this doesn't happen in a person's brain. It's not happening in a vacuum. That there's actually, a person has a story, has life events. The person is in a class, has a gender, has a race, has a religion, has all of these different kinds of factors that play into the development. The cause in an alternative approach, well, I say trauma, that might be one of the ways of looking at it. Existential struggle narrative events, things that happen to people, socio-developmental, so basically social factors. The nature of psychosis in an alternative approach, purposeful, understandable, valid, experiential, which isn't to say like good. I'm not saying that it's a good experience to always have. When I say purposeful, I just mean that it might actually come from somewhere. It might be trying to do something. The approach, well, at least with Soteria, this idea of being with it, attempts to understand it, allying with the person, and meaning-making around it. The goal, the completion of the process of psychosis and the integration of the experience, not the wiping out of it. And the outlook, I put hopeful, and this possibility of what John Pierre Wary called weller than well, which is basically the idea. John Pierre Wary ran a place called Diabasis in the 70s, which used very little medication, I think no medication, with people with psychosis. And he said the people that got well in there were weller than well because they had learned something very significant from the experience. So the fever analogy, to allow or not to allow. Your body mounts a fever to kill off bad bacteria and viruses. You don't have agency over that process. In other words, you don't decide, I want to go into a fever right now. It happens to you. The intelligence of your body drives this process. You are sick before the fever, and the fever is an attempt to make you better. So fevers can rid you of bad guys and ultimately leave you better off, but they can also kill you. The central debate is, should we allow this process or should we squelch it? Apparently, the medical community generally errs on the side of reducing the fever and thus interfering with the body's innate intelligence. Yet when the bad guys survive, then the bad guys survive, and unless you're lucky, are likely to harm you until you find another way to get rid of them. It's not difficult to see the analogy of this process with psychosis. Psychosis also happens to people. Generally, no one decides to start being psychotic unless they're taking LSD. And where does it come from? The overwhelming ideology has been from disease, whatever that means, and thus the effort to squelch it. But what if, like a fever, psychosis is not the problem in itself, but is rather the solution being mounted by your body and mind's innate intelligence? Is it possible that psychosis could be an attempt to reorganize one's orientation toward the world, particularly an orientation that has been damaged by trauma? And that the reorganization, much like the effects of high temperature, look temporarily like illness. Of course, there can be no objective data proving or not proving such a subjective claim, but there's plenty of anecdotal. Stories abound who people recovered who believe that the process of psychosis, while terrifying and even dangerous, was ultimately necessary and brought them to a more complete and integrated understanding of the world. All the rest of the slides are on Soteria. So before I go into that, I just want to know, I just said a lot about a lot of things and also about this sort of idea of could psychosis be something different. What do you all think about this? No, not buying it. Ruth, why aren't you buying it?
No. My feeling medical opinion is don't treat a fever unless it's so high it can cause seizures, such as 104 in a kid. Generally do. The opinion is don't get Tylenol or aspirin to reduce a fever. Let nature take its course of disease going on.
So how can we just implant that onto mental health? I don't want to. I have an opinion about this too. I'm preaching this, but it doesn't mean I believe it. I want to get into that in a second, but I'm wondering what you guys think about this idea. Yeah.
What about substance abuse as being a trigger for many people who develop psychosis?
Absolutely.
And what does Soteria say about that? And given the people who are incarcerated who do have perhaps a psychotic episode, many of those people have been using drugs, and that's why they're in alcohol, and that's why they're incarcerated.
Yeah. Soteria actually doesn't say that this. They don't say that psychosis is an attempt to reorganize yourself or anything. This was Stephen area. There's absolute evidence that people like taking crystal meth have a psychotic episode and stuff like that. I think there's multiple pathways to psychosis. I don't think this is clean, sort of like this is the only pathway. I think it's absolutely possible that people have psychosis from taking drugs, and in that case, removing the drugs would be good. Yes?
Mine is less a theory or an idea about how it comes about, but kind of like if anything going on, whether it's an illness or just anything going on physically or biochemically, that if you're having psychosis, it's a signal of something going on, and rather than just immediately shoving, something, whether it's medication or other therapies or treatment at it, or trying to address it without properly investigating and, experiencing it, and then looking at it, maybe, talking to the person, you had these experiences going on, or maybe you're really sick with something else, or it's environmental, or, looking at the different pieces before you just find a solution to it, like giving it that time to let it kind of come out and see what's going on.
Yeah, great. Two more. Yeah, Heidi.
Well, I would say, in agreeing with other people, that different psychoses are different, and you want to look at each individual situation freshly. I had a situation where I started hallucinating, and I went to my doctor and told her I was hallucinating, and she asked me stuff about my living environment, tested me for lead poisoning because my landlord was scraping paint, and sure enough, I was lead poisoned, and I took MSM for a few months, and I was better, and the hallucinating was caused by that. So it's like you don't want to just automatically say hallucinating is okay and let's just treat people psychosocially, because there could be a medical reason too. Like
Absolutely.
It's all different.
Yep, absolutely. Soteria is going to have a psychiatrist, a part-time psychiatrist, and we're going to also have a naturopath. And a naturopath can look at things like toxicities and does food intolerance tests and kind of look at environmental factors that might be playing into something like that. And one more, yeah, Robert. I'm sorry, I just said Soteria will have a psychiatrist.
People who were asking questions, could they speak?
Oh, people that are asking questions. Okay, well, Robert will be the last one, so shout.
I find your presentation quite provocative and makes me rethink some assumptions that have been long held by me and others, I'm sure. But my real purpose in speaking is that there's about 12 seats over here. There's a way around back where maybe if you could come through. It just seems weird that you all are standing when there's seats.
Yeah, people want to have a seat. Go ahead. I go through this analogy. I think it's dangerous to latch on to any one theory of psychosis. I mean, as much as I sort of am a critic of the biomedical paradigm, I'm more of a critic of the approach than the actual underlying ideology. I think that it's possible that people could be having some kind of organic brain thing. I just haven't seen the evidence for it. And what I have seen the evidence for it is that a lot of people have had trauma and they have stories. And the content of the psychosis, if you kind of get into it, that there generally is some meaning there. But I don't believe wholeheartedly that psychosis is a psychological attempt to reorganize one. But I do believe that that's true for some people, and some people say that as part of their story. And I go through this because I feel like we have to just start shaking up our solid, concrete worldview about what it is and what we're seeing when we're talking to people, and start just trying to creatively think about, well, what else could this possibly be? Because currently the paradigm is obviously not working. Yeah. Did you want to say one more thing? Yeah.
What the lady there said, it's standard medical practice when I'm a physician, but not a psychiatrist. When people present with psychosis, there's a massive differential diagnosis, and the first step is to determine the cause of the psychosis. It could be lead poisoning, it could be a virus, hundreds of things. So I think you're talking about psychosis caused by what we normally call serious mental illnesses, because definitely there needs to be a medical workup first to rule out other worse causes.
I don't believe in the idea of mental illness, though. I mean, I think if it is something in your brain, that's a neurological problem. And I think that if it's not something in your brain, then it has something to do with your life. And that's a classic sort of Thomas Zaz, who just passed away this week, the problems of living kind of argument. I think that when we start to get into whose mind is ill and whose is not, we've got problems. I mean, we're going to start running into some real dangerous territory. And I think particularly because my mind was diagnosed as ill, and I've had people talk down to me about that it's obviously, so I'm sort of infused with the kind of wanting to change that dynamic entirely, because I had stuff to say. It's just people weren't listening. Yes?
Has there been any placebo work with kind of trials of people taking antipsychotics and people maybe taking antipsychotics or not? Like, is there, I haven't gotten the sense there's much hope attached to the possibility that antipsychotics really help you and make a difference, as there is with a lot of antidepressants and stimulant meds. And I'm wondering if there to do with just the diagnosis, or if there's something about, I don't know.
As far as I understand, there's hardly any studies, double-blind studies done about how do people do taking antipsychotics versus how do people do taking sugar pills. I thought there hadn't been any in decades because it was considered unethical in the national treatment guidelines. But Sandy Steingard showed a meta-analysis review today that did show that the effect of people taking antipsychotics showed a little bit of an improvement over placebo, but it was so small that she was saying that it wasn't clinically relevant or clinically worth the risks of it. The question about the hopelessness, yeah, I mean, psychiatry, like schizophrenia is, Thomas As called it psychiatry's holy cow. It's basically sort of a sacred thing of like, well, if we don't have evidence for the other mental illnesses, this is the one that's really bad. So people, when they think of schizophrenia, and that, they usually think of that as being the most chronic and the most devastating. And sometimes people diagnosed with that, it is. But because of that, yes, the message of hopelessness and is definitely higher, I think, than stuff when people are diagnosed with depression or even with bipolar disorder. So let's look at Soteria. The Soteria approach towards meds. Oh, and by the way, if you want to follow up on that, I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards. I don't mean it actually. The Soteria's approach towards meds was to have a part-time psychiatrist. It was not anti-medication, but it saw meds as being a least desirable option. No one was forced to take medications ever at Soteria. I should say they didn't use coercion. However, they said they used sometimes persuasion. I'm not sure the line between persuasion and coercion, but I get it. You know, sometimes when you really know somebody, the way that you can have, if you've got a really good relationship, that conversation, there can be persuasion in there, and it's not the sort of same debilitating coercion like, hey, you can get out of here in a week if you take your meds. It's not, it's a sort of different kind of thing. The first 6 weeks were generally drug-free, except in extraordinary circumstances. Low doses and short durations was the ideal. So it was the idea that sometimes people would take antipsychotics for 10 days when they were in a really, really, really acute crisis and nothing else seems to be helping, and then they would go off. It was not this idea of sort of maintenance therapy. Benzos were sometimes used in the short term, mostly to help people restore sleep. At one point I had heard that basically everyone that came in was offered benzos just to get sleeping patterns back together because you guys, I'm sure, have seen, most people that enter into psychosis have not been sleeping for long periods of time. The house rules, they've had 4 house rules that were concrete. No violence to self or others, no unknown announced visitors, but family and friends and neighbors had easy access. No illegal drugs, although they did allow alcohol, and no sex between staff and clients. Sex between clients or staff was not forbidden. I was wondering about this. In the current mental health system in group homes, can clients have sex with each other in the same house? All right, cool, good. I'm glad that that's not like a... Oh, okay. 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 So those were the house rules. Sometimes they would have other rules. There's a great story in there. Sometimes because it was an open system and they had community meetings with everybody. There was a story of this one guy that came in and his name was Hal and he started drinking a lot. And the community was like, well, we don't want to go to banning alcohol. What they did instead was everyone in the house said, we're going to give up. This is a house problem. We're all going to give up drinking for 2 weeks. Not knowing if Hal was going to buy into it. And he did. He quit drinking for 2 weeks and it wasn't a problem after that. So they would sometimes impose their own kind of self-imposed rules. The characteristics of staff was hugely important. These were going to be the people that were there, that were sort of the presence. They hired people that were psychologically strong, independent, mature, warm, and empathic. Soteria's staff was significantly more intuitive, introverted, flexible, and tolerant of altered states of consciousness than the general hospital psychiatric ward staff. They hired open-minded folks without degrees in psychology or dogmatic views of mental illness. Not always. Sometimes people with psychology degrees, but they didn't want people thinking like that. So they were more hopeful. The staff were more hopeful and did not see such a poor prognosis. They worked 24 or 48-hour shifts, which created the opportunity to be with residents for periods of time that staff of ordinary psychiatric facilities could not. Always at least 2 people on, but usually more, because they usually had a lot of volunteers coming in, typically a man and a woman. So people were working 24, 48-hour shifts, sometimes up all night working with one person, but they didn't want to sort of interrupt the continuity if someone was having a really strong connection. So here's the basic map of what happened inside Soteria. The overarching attitude was what you see, hear, and feel is what you've got. Deal with it as best as you can. There was this idea, these are sort of some of the principles, or these aren't like the articulated principles, but this is what I've gathered from looking at it. What people did was this sort of idea of being with others, validation, this flexibility and adaptability, the importance of relationships, empowerment, and community. So I want to go through each of these. Being with people in distressed states was literally the default treatment at Soteria House. That's what they did more than anything. They were with people. This was not sort of this wasn't just sort of a lofty kind of weird abstract term. It was basically an active process of attending to and following another's path without preconception or unnecessary interference. It was a task of widening, going with the flow. Alma, the house manager, told me they followed people's paths. It was softening one's ideologies and reactions to become more attentive. It was about listening openly and having genuine curiosity in another's expression, even if it was hard to relate to it. And it really required a willingness to be uncomfortable, to take risks, and to live with uncertainty. So what does that look like in practice? It looked like, first of all, a lot of normal daily living. Morning meetings, cleaning, cooking, chess, watching TV, going out to the park, on walks, to the movies, to jobs, to the beach, and so on. Soteria had much looser boundaries around relationships, so people would spend a lot of time with each other, be friends with each other outside of the work, sometimes stay with each other afterwards, even stay with staff. They found that being with generally happened in 3 overlapping stages. There was sort of the being with when people were in crisis. There was when people started to reconstitute their orientation to the world. And then there was a being with people when they had the extension, which was sort of when they would start to reach out to more people. So this looked like attending to regression and rebirth. It looked like attending to the experience of death and dying, taking it seriously, helping to facilitate people's processes, and staying with people until safe. I'll give you a hard example. I mean, the book is great, and it goes through a lot of these different kinds of situations, and you really get a flavor for what it was like for people living at Soteria. So, there's stories abound in there. I mean, like of a woman believing that she's pregnant. So Soteria staff didn't say you're not pregnant. They went through the pregnancy process with her. There was a guy that felt like he had to be reborn. He was stuck on it, and he was crawling on the ground and doing all of this kind of strange stuff. And the staff actually acted like a canal. They put themselves next to him and one on top that he then came out of, and he kept trying to do it to get it right. And eventually he did. He didn't get it right that time. It's just, people thinking that an alien ship was going to come down at a certain time of night, and so staff taking them to the park to go meet the aliens, never denying it, but once a person saw that the aliens aren't coming, they felt all right. This is a woman going to, with someone at Soteria to like a Hallmark kind of store, and the person all of a sudden gets in front of the cards with, I think one of the cards of the Virgin Mary, and starts praying in the hallway to it, and the staffers was kind of like, oh, what am I going to do? Because this is, don't know what to do. Eventually got the woman, the woman decided, got up with her and they left. But for an hour on the way home, she kept falling to her knees and praying. So the staff person just did it with her. Went down and prayed with her. That's what being with is when it's like in practice. It's sort of really attending to the experience. It was not uncommon for an individual staff member to spend entire shifts for weeks on end with one resident, often even sleeping in the same room. There was lots of all-nighters. They even slept in the same bed sometimes with people, held people. There was a lot of touch. There was a woman that wanted to breastfeed from a staff. The staff person was like, I'm not going to breastfeed. But what they did do was they went and they got a bottle, and she basically nursed her. This might sound really wacky and strange and stuff, but I showed you those charts at the beginning. They had results as good or better than the traditional hospitals with hardly any medications. Sometimes when I think about this, I think, one of the reasons why we aren't doing very well with psychosis and stuff like that is because we keep wanting it to fit into this rigid box of what's safe and what's not, and we want to do like the rational thing, but it's not rational. I'm getting fired up. People in specific stages were then helpful to people at others. This was great. Over time, what would happen is that 6 people live there. someone would get better after having the experience. For instance, they tell a story of a woman thought everyone was the devil and was reading her mind. And then she got better where she no longer believed that experience. And this new guy came in who was of crisis and was having a similar experience. And so she was sitting down with him and she was just laughing she was like, yeah, man, a month ago I was totally thinking the same thing and blah, blah, blah. I mean, what could be more valuable at that moment for that guy to hear? To see this other person that had just been through this but had found some kind of way that it wasn't disturbing her anymore. Validation. Again, the current approach, the clinical approach, is generally that the content of psychosis makes no sense and it's even inappropriate to interact with or validate it. I had a friend that was working in the system and apparently she was told that she can't talk to not to interact with anyone's voices or anything. Is that sort of general practice in like a hospital setting or I don't know. That's I'm seeing some heads yes and some heads no, but that's what I've come across. It might not be across the board. But at Soteria, the validation of another experience meant not only acknowledging that the experience was real, or at least real to the person, but demonstrating that they had interest in and that care for its content. It wasn't just about okay, this is real for you, but it's not real for me. It was literally trying to put themselves in the other person's shoes and understand it from that perspective. There was an attempt to understand the actual experience from the point of view of the person experiencing it. And validation crucially created trust, created friendships, which then allowed for connection. And I put up there, I don't think you can actually fake it, though, by really believing that there's a disease and that everything else is a rational fodder and then pretending to connect. I think you got to really believe in yourself that, have sort of suspended certainty about what's going on so that you can really kind of get in and try and listen differently. There was flexibility and adaptability at the house. Every psychosis, we start from scratch. That's what Alma told me. That was their theoretical framework. There was no prescriptive rules governed Soteria staff's therapeutic approach. From this stance evolved bottom-up a number of techniques which were neither imposed nor theoretically predetermined. Such techniques grew out of the repetitive interactions that took place. Soteria got better over time. They learned a lot, but they still didn't put it into a theory. The presence of multiple, shifting, and often ill-defined roles in relationships created an environment that could respond rapidly and flexibly to changing demands. Oftentimes, if you walked into Soteria, it'd be hard to tell who was the clients and who was the staff. Unusual behavior was, of course, accepted and acceptable. Controlling such behavior was specifically forbidden unless a situation became dangerous. And then they would respond to it with people power. So the same guy that had the experience of wanting to go through the birth canal, he also wanted to go out the second floor window because he thought that was a canal, so they held him back. And that's what you would do to create safety there. The idea at Soteria was relationship as ends, not means. The relationships were the goal. It wasn't sort of a means to do other kinds of treatment. Probably the single most important part of why it worked were the kinds of relationships established between the participants, staff, clients, volunteers, students, anyone that spent a significant amount of time in the facility. The relationships, the quality of the relationships were the most important. I'm not going to read the second slide. The third one, loose boundaries, the importance of touch. People giving each other massages and hugging each other. This is the opposite of what I talked about this morning, about this idea that the staff person wanted to hug this woman that was really upset in the hospital, and they should have done it. That was what was right at that moment. But there's these rules that say you can't do that kind of stuff. And I don't know if it's fear. To me, it reinforces the idea that we think that these people us people are animals or something. But I guess it's coming from this liability, or people will say, oh, well, some people don't want it to be touched. And that might be true, but I hate it how the sort of blame always goes on the individual. Some people want to be touched, though, too. So why do we have to sort of go to this policy of no touch? But anyways, they did a lot of touch at Soteria. And I wrote this idea of navigating sexuality because they talk about that. They were open about it. People sometimes, when they were in crisis, would get really sexual and, kind of do wild things. But the staff were mature and they were able to handle that. And they didn't sort of poo-poo it, but they just didn't go with it. Extension of the relationship well beyond the walls of Soteria. Like I said, people would hang out afterwards. The house manager, Voice Hendricks, took one of the guys to Disneyland with his family. Voice told me that, he still knows some of the people that were there 25 years ago. They still talk on the phone. So this was about like a real kind of family community. The nature of the relationships, again, non-professionalized. It was not expert-client. Staff were allowed to say what they felt, even if their positions disagreed with others. What was important was that each communicated openly and clearly. So this wasn't like staff couldn't say, hey, you're pissing me off. They absolutely could say stuff like that. It was an adiagnostic environment, and instead they used everyday language. You know, this person's freaked out, bummed out, they're spacey today, and stuff like that. It wasn't these sort of medical terms. And, you know, I put this up there just for the idea of language creating reality. If we've got a person here and we surround them with schizophrenic, symptomatic, chemically imbalanced, self-regulating, maintenance, stability, high or low functioning, compliant, non-compliant, at baseline, decompensating, you lose that somewhere in all that. These are words for machines. High or low functioning, compliant, you know, baseline, decompensate. Who says, man, I'm feeling so decompensated today? It's not how we talk. We need to start getting into the real world. Empowerment. The idea of preservation, they really valued people's personal power and they wanted to maintain people's autonomy. They had a relatively egalitarian approach to relationships and to the house functioning. The environment there was set up to share power, to create safety, value the person, never demean, minimize, oppress, or objectively label his or her experience. And the staff was conscious of power dynamics and was entirely transparent about them, always seeking to reduce their harm. And just a couple more. The community, again, over time, a culture developed at Soteria. As people would leave the house, come back, volunteers would come. And basically a Soteria culture eventually developed. And people would take care of each other. People would help each other who had gone out, and gotten a job, would then come back and help other people get jobs, do stuff like that. A very peer support community. So that's the old sort of, that's what Soteria was. And I put Soteria 2.0 because as we start to look at, what are we going to do with the Soteria in Vermont, we're also going to add in sort of the naturopathic perspective, have a naturopath there. I think this is really important and different. I mean, that sort of changes the kind of conversation that happens with the medical conversation that happens when you have that perspective. The idea of food and diet. I mean, apparently people at the original Soteria ate well as well. But, food and mood and all of this kind of stuff is very intricately connected. And, yeah, there is some evidence to show that things like gut disorders, that different kinds of food intolerances can really lead to psychotic activity. If not that, then a whole ton of anxiety. So sort of looking at, well, what kind of food do we have? This idea of a rage room. John Weir Perry had at Diabasis this room with padded walls and stuff. And they had, foam swords, and people could go in there and just get it out, and beat. And they found that to be a helpful thing. Sort of the opposite of a seclusion room, because it was open door and yeah. This idea of pathways to housing, I think I have to convince Hillary, I don't know if Hillary, if I need to tell you about this. But this idea of supportive aftercare, but like the idea that the original Soteria, people that left Soteria had lower rates of rehospitalization, but man, they still had high rates of rehospitalization. I want to see if we can try and do better. Maybe we can, maybe we can't. But what would it look like if people left Soteria and then there was something like a pathways model, which is basically an ACT-supported team, and it's based on housing first principles, so it's not coercive. What would it look like to have that available to you now that you're off into your own apartment for the next year or two? I think that could be huge. Peer support has advanced. I mean, some people say it's regressed, but in terms of there's a lot more knowledge out there about peer support and a lot more training that I think can be really helpful. And this idea of staying integrative in lives, that was part of the original Soteria as well. So, and then I just put some of the anticipated challenges. Staff burnout. Although I have to say that the original Soteria, some people stay the entire 11 years. The house manager made $10 an hour in today's funds, and he stayed with it. So people were seriously passionate about it that did stay. Some people stay with it 5-7 years. But they did have a lot of staff turnover because it's highly demanding work. Obviously very rewarding when people actually do come through that process and they're sort of back to their lives and move on. I see a challenge in sort of neighborhood and community acceptance. I think what we're talking about in the larger picture is having communities that are more tolerant of different kinds of behaviors. Ideological rigidity on both sides. I think, there's sort of this yes meds, no meds, or psychosocial or psychiatry, and, it can get really sort of rigid. And I can see that as being a challenge. And, I don't think, like I said, I don't think Soteria is going to be a panacea by any means. Some people don't get better there. That can be a demoralizing factor. This idea of the revolving door syndrome, if someone leaves Soteria and they end up going back to the hospital, is the hospital going to think, wow, that Soteria program, they really don't work very well? It's something I want to be conscious of from the outset and really have a lot of communication about what we are and what we aren't doing. Finding and receiving first break referrals. We've got competition these days. There's always first break programs springing up. So that might be a challenge. And lastly, I think that just the idea of objectivity. I mean, this is a program that there's a lot of people that are passionate about it. There's also, I think, a lot of people that probably don't want this program to work because it could prove something that might be threatening. And I think that we all sort of have an obligation to be skeptical and to really try and look at it from a perspective. I'm not wed to this being the model that's going to really help with first break psychosis. I hope it helps a lot of people, but if it doesn't, then we got to just find other alternative models and keep going that route. And that's the end of my presentation. So I think we probably have a few minutes for some. Well, yes, we've got 10 minutes if people want to talk. Thank you. Laura, do you want to come up too? Laura's the program assistant on Soteria, Vermont. And I don't know if Hillary, if you want to come up too? Okay. Here, we can just sit down up here. Okay. Yes?
What happened when there was violence in the Soteria program? Like, that was one of the rules, so what happened when it did occur?
Well, as far as I can tell, I mean, they said that they had about 10 incidents of violence in their 12 years at the original Soteria, and that most of them were minor injuries. I actually had a slide in here on violence, but I decided not to go there because it's very hard to talk about violence with this stuff because I don't want to perpetuate the idea that people are always violent. But it is a very real thing, and there's a whole sort of chapter on it in there. They responded to violence individually, with different kinds of approaches. They basically looked at the circumstance, how it affected other people. Different staff had different tolerances for violence, so some could sort of handle verbal abuse better than others. So it wasn't sort of there was no like overarching protocol on it. I think they had very different approaches.
And you weren't kicked out or anything?
Well, I think that I know at the Soteria in Alaska they've kicked people out for threats of violence. I think that I didn't talk a lot about the Soteria Alaska because I don't know enough about it to know if it's really doing this or if it's sort of a different thing. As far as I know, I think that some of it's very different. But I don't know. I don't know. They tell stories in there about how they responded specifically to it. I can't remember any stories about someone being kicked out. Although I would imagine that if someone's violent, and I think we all have rights. If a staff person is attacked by somebody, that staff person has just as much rights as the person attacking. And if the staff person doesn't want that person there while they're there or something, I mean, sometimes you can figure out situations like, well, maybe the staff person doesn't come when the person's there or something like that. I don't know. But yeah. Yep.
Two quick things. One is, what was sort of the average length of stay and the range of length of stay? And the other one, I can definitely see why it makes sense mostly focusing on younger people, but why only first? I mean, I have like 3 people right in my mind that I would love to see try this model. They're young adults, they're fairly new in the process, but it's not a first break. And I guess I'm not seeing why you would restrict it to that.
Well, I think they ended up taking people that weren't all first break because they had funding problems and they had to start taking private referrals. And there's been Soteria replicas that have opened that take people from all different kinds of stages. It's a different animal. The reason why it's different, what's more important is, has a person been taking drugs for a long time? If they've been taking psychiatric drugs for like 6 months, it's a very different kind of thing. Because now someone's dealing with sort of an altered brain, so you're dealing with sort of a different kind of, I don't want to say animal, obviously, but you know what I mean. You're sort of dealing with a very different kind of presentation. The other thing that happens is if people have gone into the mental health system, it's possible that they become institutionalized, and in other words, internalize the messages that are given to them about mental illness. Usually that takes a lot longer than sort of like, one stay or something like that. But the great thing about doing first break is sort of you're not working with any of that. You're not working with any learned patienthood, and people aren't even generally thinking of themselves as having any kind of mental illness. So you're sort of working with a different kind of presentation.
I understand like the perks to it. What I don't understand, I guess, is why exclude. I mean, if you're working with young adults, for saying I've tried this
Well, I think we're going to have to do a lot of thinking on that, and I would love to hear more of your thoughts on it. I mean, I put my information up here too, and if you go to that website, you can sign up for our newsletter.
We also have a sign-up sheet for if you want to join a mailing list. You can leave your information there.
Oh, great. Yeah, and I've got cards here and more info on this and stuff, because I think this is a conversation we have to have. There's going to be pressure on us to take people that aren't exclusively having a first break. And I guess without saying too much, I mean, I've been sort of warned. I think Soteria Alaska has done a lot of not taking first break people, and I think it's been problematic. And so I want to I think part of my job is going to be to sort of research this stuff more and flesh it out. So let's continue it. Yeah. Yes.
Since Soteria allows sex between residents, I was wondering if there's ever been anyone's ever tried to sue for Soteria for allowing that.
I didn't see any mention in there of anyone ever of them being sued for anything. Yeah. Yes, and then you. Yes.
Have you given any thought to evaluating the success of your program as compared to business as usual?
Yeah, I mean, we're funded by the Department of Mental Health. I don't think the Department of Mental Health funds research as far as I understand, but we are talking with people about, I mean, I would love to study it. I would love to study it rigorously. It's hard to do that, and it's hard to, in terms of having like a true, like, matched, controlled study. But I think we definitely want to take evaluation seriously. So whether it's sort of arbitrary, or whether it's sort of done in-house, or whether it's done by independent evaluators, or whether it's done as against treatment as usual, we definitely want to explore that more. We're going to be in Chittenden County. Part of being up there, we're near University of Vermont, St. Michael's College, and there's some interest there. Yep. Oh, okay, great. Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah.
So I've been using the ACE study questionnaire with my patients. I'm just wondering, with the amount of trauma that you may come up against and see in people's history, what kind of services are going to be available for them as far as counseling and trauma survivor kind of services? Are they going to be integrated into this model, or is this something they'd have to receive outside through different?
Well, I think the model is trauma-informed. It's the idea of looking at what happened to you, not, what's wrong with you. I think that this approach is sort of a response to, the fact that people have trauma. I don't think it's not focused trauma therapy. I don't know. I don't know how I don't think we'll have trauma therapists there. But I think that, I guess I could see a role for therapy, like people who wanted to go to therapy, that being definitely an option. John Weir Perry's Diabasis, they had most of the Soteria elements, but they actually said people had to do therapy that came there, Jungian therapy, which was interesting. He's got a really good book, Trials of the Visionary Mind. It's a little bit, I get weary about the sort of romanticization of psychosis, but he actually doesn't really do that. It just kind of sounds like that. It's, it was written in the 70s, I think. But it's, so I think we'll be exploring, like what services are out there, and people want stuff. If people want help getting a job, there's also the Wellness Co-op is now in Burlington, which is a peer support center, and maybe people will want to go hang out there. Soteria is definitely not like a closed facility. Yep. Yes.
Why did it close?
Funding. The sort of short story is funding. There was a number of reasons why. I think a number of reasons that played into that, and I think that they talk about in the book that it was a threat to the emerging model, the neo kind of Kreplin, like mental illness is a biological problem. When the DSM-3 came out, that was sort of like the new, it's all a biological problem. And this was a threat. And they actually, during the time that it was open, published a lot of studies. I think it was like 16. So it was sort of like on, people were talking about it. It wasn't like this like unheard of thing, but it faded into obscurity really quick after 1981. Yes, and then Graham, yeah.
Would Soteria be helping folks withdraw from medication safely, or is that?
Oh, I definitely think we need that program. I don't think Soteria is that. Will we ever do that? I don't know. I think we want to open the program and try and stick to sort of the pure, like purist, like this is what worked, try and sort of enhance it, but not alter too much of that kind of stuff. Because again, I think when you're coming off of meds, it's kind of a different experience. Yeah, Graham.
I think a really wise thinking about staff support support, retention, because I think they're really challenging.
Yeah.
As you know, I started in a place kind of similar to this in England, and it was really hard work. I lasted about a year and a half.
Was that Kinsley Hall?
No.
Oh, okay.
But it was, we took that model into consideration. But it was, you know, it's really hard work. And when I came to Vermont and we set up Beacon House, which had some structure and clients got medicated, for the staff, it was a hell of a lot easier.
Yeah.
Good luck.
No. Yeah, I don't. I mean, I'm going to develop the project. I don't know if I want to work in it. It is going to be hard work. This is extraordinarily hard work. I've gotten a taste of it, you know, working in another way. We try and really work with people and support people's choices. And a lot of people don't want to take medications and have things that are called psychosis, and they can be very difficult. Yeah. But I'm hoping to find the right blend of young people with ideals. Yes.
How involved was Mosher in the day-to-day functioning of Soteria?
How involved was Mosher? Yeah. He would sometimes do shifts and stuff there. I think they had to kind of become more administrators over time as there was more demand on the reporting and on getting funding. They had to do a lot more fundraising. But yeah, I mean, he was sometimes just like a house worker there, which I think is significant. I mean, that's what we tried to do it another way too. That the director role has also is also doing peer support and stuff like that. Yep. Yes.
To kind of play off of the question that we had over here about first break. I mean, I've read Robert Whitaker's stuff and just some other things that I know about.
I'm sorry, can you speak?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Not that this is data-driven or outcome-driven, but it would seem that it makes sense to do that as far as a model to do, you know, work with people who have first break experiences, because you can see better if that would work, where like you're saying other things I don't want to say would contaminate, you know, being able to tell that, but it just seems like, I mean, just because when she raised that question, it made me think, you know, you have to kind of start somewhere.
Yeah.
It seemed, and then that, like, when you made that choice, was it, like, how did that work when it came together with, like, the MH and you guys, you know, like, the team that kind of formulated all this?
Well, the short story is basically, I mean, that I think there's been several people that have been advocating for a model like this for years. Commissioner Flood went and saw Robert Whitaker about a year and a half ago and really was intrigued by what he had to say. And then I've been talking with Patrick about sort of like doing alternatives. And I think he's really he really wants to sort of have a system that has a diversity of options. And I think my argument has been we need something tangible, not just a recovery philosophy, because that's too in the air. We need like a structure. And anyway, so I think that it kind of came because, you know, we have an administration that's supportive of it, that buys into the basic arguments of it, and a legislature that's supportive of it. It makes me proud to be in Vermont. And if we're going to really do alternatives to the medical model, you know, there is going to be these periods of time of experimentation. Not everything is going to be work well. We're going to have to tweak things, but we have to start somewhere. I mean, the data I showed you at the beginning, we clearly don't, you know, we got to start trying different things.
I was just curious, because
Yeah.
I've been hearing about it for a while that maybe it was coming, and we were like, yes. Yeah.
Great. Is there anything else? Well, I hope if you guys want to stay sort of connected, like I said, there's a monthly update coming out. You take my card or sign up on the phone. Thank you very much.